All right, welcome to the Pangburn Philosophy Podcast. This is Travis Pangburn. I am joined today by a very special guest, Bret Weinstein, the evolutionary theorist and the professor in exile. Thanks for coming on today, Bret.
Thanks for having me on, Travis.
Awesome. So let's bring listeners up to speed as to why you are in exile.
Yeah, it's a complex story, and in order to get it right, we would need hours and hours, but we could do a shorter version, and if people are interested in the longer story, I would recommend that they look at the piece that Heather Hying and Heather is my wife and was a fellow professor at Evergreen. We wrote a piece for the Washington Examiner that does the best job of explaining the events at Evergreen. But the short version is that there were some equity proposals being floated by my faculty colleagues at Evergreen. They were ill conceived and very dangerous to the college, and I spoke up and said so. That resulted in a lot of pushback from faculty colleagues that then morphed into what I think was a very inorganic student protest. Ultimately, 50 students that I had never met showed up at my classroom and disrupted not only my class, but all the classes in the building. And they demanded my resignation or my firing. Ultimately, they partnered with the president of the college. And although my wife and I resigned, we resigned effectively because we had to, as the administration had literally stood down the police force as I was being hunted by a mob of students with unknown intent. And then the college refused to acknowledge that they had created danger for us, making the campus quite inhospitable. So you can't sue a state entity without 60 days notice in the state of Washington. So we did not ultimately end up filing suit. We settled out of court before the suit was filed, but we were planning to sue the college. They finally sat down with us, and it was clear that they were not going to acknowledge anything on their part that been had been incorrect in terms of keeping the campus safe and hospitable, and settling with the college was our best option.
Yeah, so correct me if I'm wrong, like people were yelling at you and calling you a racist.
They certainly started out calling me a racist. I think at some point, relatively early in the protests, which then became riots, I think it became clear to someone at least that accusation was backfiring. And so there was a moment, initially the protest began with students chanting, "Hey, hey, ho, ho, Bret Weinstein's got to go." And there was a point a day or so in at which the chant suddenly morphed into, "Hey, hey, ho, ho, these racist faculty have got to go." I think there was a high level decision that calling me a racist was not good strategy because there were too many people who knew better. So by making it generic, they preserved the idea that somewhere on Evergreen's faculty were racists, and they stopped leveling the accusation at me.
Right. So what was the key issue that brought race even into the mix at all?
Well, the true answer to that question is that there is a de facto rule on college campuses these days that if you oppose a proposal that has been described as pro-equity, that you are understood to be against racial equity. In other words, you are understood to be a racist. I oppose proposals because they were dangerous to the college and they violated some principles that are uh, quite basic. So I was portrayed as a racist. What the protesters claimed they were responding to on the day that 50 of them showed up in my classroom was my opposition to something called the Day of Absence. Day of Absence was a tradition at Evergreen's campus going back almost to the founding of the college, early 70s. Originally, black faculty, staff, and students stayed away from the college for one day to emphasize the important roles they played. Day of Absence was a play in which, in a fictitious southern town, the black population didn't show up for work one day in order to emphasize their importance. And so the college used that trope as a tradition to demonstrate the same thing. It never had very much impact on my life. In 14 years of teaching at the college, I can't remember a single student not showing up to my class because they were participating, but I think there were other, in the humanities, it was more likely that students might stay away. But in any case, in 2017, the committee who organizes Day of Absence decided, instead of absenting the Black population, it had been broadened to people of color more generally, but instead of people absenting themselves, that the organizers would invite white people not to show up to campus, which offended me as a liberal, as a person who believes that we should be judged on the content of our character rather than the color of our skin. The idea that anybody is going to tell anybody else not to show up to a college on the basis that their skin was the wrong color struck me as offensive, and I said so in an email, which the organizers of the protests decided made it clear that I must be a racist, when in fact a careful reading of my email reveals just the opposite.
Right.
But in any case, that was the thing they decided to point to in setting their protest in motion.
Right. Well, I mean, that's such a shame after spending 14 years with the institution that things came to an end that way. Now, is there legal proceedings taking place right now, or where are things at with that?
Well, we've settled with the college, so we've officially separated from the college. We no longer teach there. The college, for some reason, forbid itself from ever rehiring us in the settlement agreement, which is something that they could presumably reverse if they wish to, but they chose to include it. So we don't have any ties to the college at the moment. There's nothing on the legal front that's proceeding at this time.
Alrighty, well that brings everyone up to speed. Yeah, I think there's some major lessons, and I definitely commend you for standing up, because I completely agree with the stance you took there.
Thanks.
Let's talk some evolution. Um,
Great.
just generally to start off, where is human evolution headed? Are we headed up? Are we headed down? I know evolution isn't a ladder that you climb, but are things getting better?
uh, yeah, that's an interesting question. Well, I would say the first thing to understand is that human beings, while we, like every other creature, are products of adaptive evolution, the way in which we evolve is quite different than most other creatures. In fact, almost all other creatures. And so that changes the nature of the question. And if we take the narrow textbook definition of adaptive evolution, then human evolution is not proceeding in any interesting direction. If we broaden our understanding so that we look at human beings as they truly are, and we understand that, in fact, we evolve at the software level, where other creatures are much more prone to evolve at the hardware level, then we understand that actually human beings are evolving all the time, and they evolve from one population to the next, and that is certainly still taking place. Unfortunately, we folks in the technologically altered world live in an environment in which the influences to which we are adapting are extremely noisy. And so while it is tempting to say that evolution takes place all the time and is continuing, that much is true. In what direction it is continuing, for people who have access to your podcast, the answer is it is proceeding chaotically, because the forces that are favoring some traits over others are not coherent forces. So I must say, I think we have bigger problems to worry about than what our evolutionary trajectory is. We have much more immediate concerns, but our evolutionary trajectory is not likely to solve most of the problems that we would like it to solve if left to its own direction.
Are we overloading our brains? Like, are we doing too much with our brains?
we are doing the wrong things with our brains. I think we all have the experience of discovering that there are bits of our programming that are frustrating to us, that we would like to be able to remember certain things, that despite the fact that we can prioritize them in our conscious minds, it doesn't result in our being effective in terms of how we use our neurobiological structures. And so this leads people to think quite incorrect things, like we only use 10% of our brain, which I think is a sloppy way of saying we only we use our minds at a small fraction of their potential efficiency if we could point them more directly. But what we do is we navigate the world in a way that leads us to focus on certain things and ignore other things. And I would say at the moment, the map of priorities that leads us to focus here and not there is a destructive map from the point of view of the values that most people hold.
Right.
If you sat down and you listed what it was you wanted to accomplish, and then you re-rigged your mental program so that it would cause you to focus on things that were productive with respect to those values, you would come out with something very different than what we actually do. So there's a lot of room for improvement, to be sure.
Right. And aren't we, I mean, it's a nice thing to think that we are in some way control of reprogramming ourselves, but I mean, when it all boils down, aren't we just at the mercy of our pleasure drives and the things that give us pleasure, and isn't that dictating what we're thinking and what we're doing?
I don't think it's as simple as one or the other of those choices. I think it is very difficult for one individual to radically alter their approach. In some sense, we are at the mercy of the influences that society places in front of us. But society could decide to alter the landscape of influences in a way that would be enhancing to almost everyone. And I don't know how to say this to people. Lots of folks tend to hear the idea that society should in some way alter the landscape of influences. They hear that as authoritarian in some way. And people who know me understand that I don't have any instinct towards authoritarianism, but I do have an instinct to something you might call mindfulness at a level above that of the individual. In other words, we collectively, I think, have a responsibility to limit the kinds of access that, let's say, advertisers have to our children. In fact,
Right.
I can't think of a single reason we should ever let advertisers access our children, and yet we do. So am I authoritarian to want to protect kids from some conglomerate that wishes to study child psychology and manipulate kids into eating things that they shouldn't or desiring things that they otherwise wouldn't? I don't think so. But nonetheless, we have in society not reached agreement on whether or not the right of everyone to do everything is paramount above our right to, for example, protect us from messages that cause us to harm ourselves.
Yeah. What about protecting children from indoctrination?
Well, as an educator, this one's near and dear to my heart. I think it is paramount that we teach children and young adults how to think and not what to think. And this is a little bit tricky because everybody who stands in front of a classroom or is otherwise in a position to educate has deep-seated beliefs that they have arrived at based on some level of consideration. And it is important and not straightforward when you first walk into a classroom, figuring out how to teach students without being dishonest with them about what you might believe, and also without imposing what you believe on them. That's a tricky tightrope to walk. Nonetheless, it is vital that we do, and it is also, I think, vital that we encode it in the culture of teaching so that people understand that actually that's an expectation that is rightly had, and that when they do indoctrinate, that they're actually falling down on their obligation to students.
Right. I see a problem that, for instance, if we come across a teacher who values something like faith when it comes to understanding, um, you know, evidence or things about how the universe came to be, um, isn't it possible that that teacher may be teaching children to not be learning in the right way?
I think it really depends on the quality of educator. I personally have been surprised sometimes when I've encountered people who are people of faith, that an intelligent person of faith can actually compartmentalize that belief structure, and they can teach in a way that does not impose it on others. That's not the most common thing, though. Very frequently, people will impose their beliefs in the classroom. So I would say if somebody has a belief structure that is relevant to the material they are teaching, then there's a real question about whether that belief structure leaves them unable to pass on the mode of thinking that is core of their subject. So, can a young earth creationist teach geology? Kind of hard to imagine. On the other hand, some of our greatest physicists have had beliefs about the nature of the universe and what it might have to do with some sort of a creator. Now, I don't share their belief, but should Einstein have been disqualified from teaching uh, about astronomical considerations because he had a arguably metaphysical view of the nature of the universe itself? Surely not. So anyway, I think the real question is, can the person charged with teaching keep their own unfalsifiable beliefs outside of what they convey? And some can, many cannot.
Yeah, it's tough because I mean, it just seems like our beliefs inform our actions, and I don't know how we can get outside that, and I think you can always say the right things if you have to. Obviously, you're going to get fired from your job if you walk into teach evolution in a class and say, "Oh, then God created human beings and the Earth is 6,000 years old." You're probably going to lose your job. Um, I'm not convinced that people are very good at separating themselves from their beliefs, especially the core existential beliefs that they hold.
Well, I think we should separate two things. I agree with you. In general, people are not good at this, but I don't think it's impossible. And in fact, I've had the shoe on the other foot many times. Teaching at a public college with an unusual student body meant that I was frequently teaching people who did have beliefs that were creationist in one regard or another, or had political beliefs that were incompatible with the conclusions that I've reached. And I must say, I always took pride in making people who disagreed with me feel comfortable and at ease in the classroom, knowing that our differences were not going to cost them, and that I wasn't going to humor beliefs that I didn't think were right, but that I was going to treat people who held beliefs that were incompatible with mine with respect.
Yeah.
And so I think it's something that one can do, and you can do it with students who disagree with you, and professors can do it with beliefs that are outside of the realm of falsification. And really, from our collective perspective, the thing is to make it clear that that is a requirement of the job.
All right, so let's move to this social evolution question. We are becoming less religious as a species. Will we finally be rid of it soon? Do you see any reason as to why we should be careful to not throw it away just yet? Do you think there's ever been a use for it? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there very clearly has been a use for it. The fact is, if this is a moment in which the atheists are going to win out over the true believers, it will be the first moment in which that has been true across a majority of planet Earth. In general, believers have outcompeted atheists, even though atheists are necessarily a part of every large population at all moments. And that really tells us something. It tells us that whatever those beliefs are, they're serving a useful role, useful with an asterisk, since useful doesn't necessarily mean good in this case. It just means evolutionarily favored. But from the point of view of what happens now, I think we're in actually kind of a troubling bind, which is we don't we don't have proper understanding of what value has been encoded in religious belief, and so we are not in a position to replace it with other things that serve the same functions. And yet we cannot proceed from those beliefs because those beliefs are almost without exception too ancient to be relevant to our modern predicament. So we we must jettison faith at some level. It doesn't mean individuals must jettison it, but we certainly cannot base policy on unfalsifiable ideas. On the other hand, if we pat ourselves on the back and we say that scientific falsification is superior to mythology, and we're just going to navigate on that basis, we're going to repeatedly discover that there was wisdom encoded in ancient belief structures that we have not yet understood, and I think it is inevitable that we will harm ourselves in the process of discovering where value was hidden.
Yeah, and I think that what you're talking about, that wisdom, is valuable, and it's not to say that it's all wisdom. There's a lot of bullshit, but there is some great wisdom to be learned. The thing is, though, is I view all of that as art, storytelling, the music. I view all of that as art. The only problem is once people start claiming that this should be a replacer for evolutionary theory and science, which is essentially just based on collecting evidence and building models. So I what I see, what might happen is that religion is just replaced by this idea of this grander idea of art.
Well, the problem is I would argue, you can't write a myth. You can write a story, and if it stands the test of time, it becomes a myth. So art doesn't say anything about how durable the content is. And some art may be effectively permanent with respect to its meaning, a timeless story, and others may be quite ephemeral. And because we can't in the present distinguish between that which will last and that which won't, yes, the content you're talking about will happen in the space of art, but we are in a very poor position to judge which parts of it are essential.
Right. Yeah, I mean, having a longer period of time to suss out what was really important and what worked definitely helps. Um,
I don't know of any way around it. That,
yeah.
time tells you which of these stories has lasting meaning, and I don't know of any way to fast forward. You can look back and you can say what story has an analog for every culture that we've studied. And if you have a story, if The Boy Who Cried Wolf exists in every culture or some version of it, that tells you, well, that's a lesson that needs to be
Yeah.
conveyed in some way.
Well, one thing, when I had Jordan Peterson on the podcast, I talked to him about this charge that people can get from religion, and I think it's a very addicting charge. Um, they're at the pulpit, they're in the church, the preacher's going, they're all charged up, the adrenaline's pumping, and I likened that much to being at a concert of your favorite artist on stage, and you're getting. I think those charges are the same, and I I think that we can get those charges from art. The one thing that Peterson mentioned is that, some of us might be able to get that kind of charge from art, but um, the problem is that once the stage lights come down, essentially, the show's over, and a lot of people want to feel that that show is still going on. I guess as an analogy, but I think it's just for a lack of trying that people can't get this same charge and effect that they get from religion.
It is not clear to me that getting the charge is in and of itself a good thing. So this is a case where I think we can see the danger of our modern environment for a creature that is evolved for a very different scenario. So just to take an analogy, people can get a charge from pornography. The reason that the thing that pornography taps into is an evolved mechanism that is linked to very deep stuff because of its historical connection to reproduction. Obviously, pornography abstracts that and turns it into something that is connected to technology and commerce. And so the charge that people feel is not a reliable indicator of, in that case, sexual value. And in the case of a concert, on the one hand, a concert may be a very unifying event, and it may actually even be a deep event, depending upon who you've gone to see and who it unites you with. On the other hand, if somebody decides, well, I want to tap into that reward center, and they decide to put together a boy band that happens to cause straight girls to go crazy before they're old enough to realize that it's a fiction, then you may be able to extract a lot of money from people buying albums and t-shirts and whatever over a charge that they feel. And the charge is real, but the value of it is, I would argue, negative. That actually it's a false triggering of a system that's built in for deep and important reasons.
Right, but what you've just described is kind of what religions have been doing since the dawn of man. Uh, in a sense, they've that charge has been a big attractor um, to get people signed up and to get people thinking and believing.
Well, I think that's a little too easy. I don't think you're wrong that you would find the sort of generic, junkified gathering, at least very commonly in human history. But I don't think that's the core of what has gone on in that space. So I think all of us who have not tapped into such a community and felt the value and the reification of having a group of people who are aligned over something real should be cautious about looking at if you came to Earth and you decided you want to know what Earthlings are about and you flipped on the radio, there's a pretty good chance you would land on something that would miss the core value of what we do, whether it was talk radio and it was a conversation that didn't really reveal the depth of what human beings are capable of, or
Katy Perry.
Katy Perry, right? Exactly. So I think and I don't want to be misheard here. I don't believe there's anything metaphysical going on in the universe.
Right.
There's something outside of physics, as far as I can tell. And I also don't believe that we can. This is a place where I disagree with Jordan Peterson. I don't think we can take religious text and adhere to it because it must have been valuable in order to stick with us as long as it has. I think we're stuck in the 21st century having to forge a new path with, unfortunately, too little data to do it well. But it's definitely a mistake to imagine that all of what has gone on is the junk version of religion. It can't possibly have been, or it would have been overrun by something better.
Right. Well, let's move on to since we brought up Peterson, Vancouver, June 23rd and 24th. We had to add an extra date because the first date sold out so quickly. And this is Sam Harris. We called it Verse Jordan Peterson, and this will be moderated by you, Bret. Um, and what do you expect to happen here? This is highly anticipated. I mean, I feel like Don King promoting this bout. Uh, what what are you anticipating? More of what we heard on the podcasts that they attempted, or something better?
Well, I think if it's a rerun of that sort of interaction, then I won't have done my job right.
Right.
I think as a moderator, I have to figure out how to prevent various kinds of suboptimal or failure modes or whatever it is. And, I don't think that should be too hard. I genuinely like both Sam and Jordan, and I think that there's an awful lot to talk about in at that place where they seem to disagree most intensely. As for how to keep us out of the weeds, that's something I put a lot of thought into. I have some plans. We will see whether or not I've properly understood how they have ended up in the weeds and how we might avoid them in Vancouver. But I'm looking forward to it. I think it's a really interesting challenge, and I also think that there's a strong possibility that we can get somewhere useful that few will expect.
Hmm.
So I'm hoping we can do that.
Yeah. Well, I'm really looking forward to that event. And if anyone's listening that's still trying to get a ticket, I apologize, but everything is completely sold out. I mean, I think I gave all my producer holds away as well to sell some more tickets because there was just so many people that still wanted to come. Um, so we will also be, Brett's going to be coming over to Australia and New Zealand for a day of reckoning. This is a conference, actually a new conference model I've been working on and creating, and this is going to be not the only stop for this style of conference. We're going to be hitting New York, Vancouver, Las Vegas. There's going to be quite a few stops around the world for this new conference model. So if you can't get over to Australia and New Zealand, don't fret. We are putting these conferences up in different parts of the world, so at some point there will be one close enough for you to get to. You might have to take a quick flight there, but we will put something close to you for sure. And make sure you email us if you're totally pissed off that we never come near where you guys live. But anyways, for this conference in Australia and New Zealand, Bret, his brother Eric Weinstein, Douglas Murray, uh, Majid Nawaz, and Sam Harris are all going to be involved for this conference. It's going to be a 1 p.m. to roughly 11:30 p.m. conference each day, one day in Auckland, one day in Sydney, and you can find more information online about what the topics are. We just released what the topics are going to be, and Josh Zepps, who is a local personality, I encourage you all to look up more about Josh Zepps. He's a political commentator and he's also a news personality in Australia. He's going to be hosting the event, so that's very exciting. So just by going through the whole process, Brett, of this day of reckoning, this is going to be a nice chunk of time, 4 90-minute segments for us to dive deeply into some really interesting topics. And I was curious, what who are you most looking forward to interacting with? Oh, and obviously Sam Harris is going to be there as well. I'm not sure if I mentioned Sam, but who are you most interested in interacting with, and what would that subject be on?
Well, I'm very interested. I mean, of course, I haven't met Majid and Douglas yet, and so I'm looking forward to that differently than Sam and Eric, for example. Um, I know Josh Steps a little bit. I went on his podcast many months ago. In any case, I think I'm looking forward to the whole thing for a couple of reasons, and they're not dissimilar from the reasons I'm looking forward to the Vancouver events. We are in a very odd period. We are, I think, forging a new path, or at least one that hasn't been seen for a very long time. Somehow we're in a moment at which people actually are tuning in to, well, frankly, into intellectual discussions out of pure interest. And that is surprising to me. I didn't expect to see that become such a big public phenomenon, but it having become one, it's very exciting. It obviously tells us that the story we've been told about our fellow citizens of Earth can't really be right if they're choosing to spend their time engaged in these deep, difficult conversations. So I think what I'm looking forward to most is, as an insider to this discussion, I'm quite aware that the discussion is new and that there is peril. There are ways in which the discussion could go awry, and there's opportunity that's yet untapped. And what I'm hoping is that these early conferences will actually augment this mode of interaction such that when they are over, our capacity to have these discussions will be enhanced from where it is right now. And at the moment, it's already enhanced over what, let's say, the mainstream media is capable of doing. So I'm looking forward to seeing what we will be able to discuss and accomplish, and watching us push the outside of that envelope.
Yeah, it's super exciting for me as well. Are you going to take part in Sam Harris's meditation workshop?
That's a really good question. I think I will probably try it.
Yeah.
I have to say I have always heard people talking about meditation and sensory deprivation and other such things. And when I have tried these things, I have felt a little defective. They don't work as easily for me as they do for other people. So maybe Sam knows how to make it work for somebody like me, in which case I'd love to have that experience. And if I discover yet again it's not my cup of tea, then so be it.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll just give you a special brownie or something before the talk begins, and we'll see what happens.
I see. All right.
um, okay, and then we really have to talk about this event with Richard Dawkins. So this will be, as far as I know, your first opportunity to be on stage with someone who's just done uh, mountains and mountains of work for the promotion of science and reason and evolutionary theory. What does it mean to be on sharing the stage in Chicago? This is coming up. Oh man, I don't even have the date in front of me.
I think it's the
This
23rd of October.
this yes, October 23rd with Richard Dawkins.
Well, it's quite the prospect, and Dawkins is extremely important to me. He is the mentor that I've never met. I read his books early on as I started to take evolutionary theory seriously, and he had a tremendous influence on me. I assigned his books very regularly when I taught because I thought he gave the best, most succinct uh, description of the state of the art that we had. And so there's a way in which just simply being able to have a back and forth with him it's quite an honor. And then there's the other part of it, which is a little strange to hear oneself saying it, but there I think there's a problem in evolutionary theory. I more or less think that evolutionary theory got stuck in 1976 and that the last big accomplishment was Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene. And I know many of my colleagues in evolutionary theory would disagree. They would say the field is very vibrant. There's lots of stuff being discovered all the time. But there are no big theoretical breakthroughs on which we have consensus in the field. That stopped 40 years ago. And what I'm most interested in talking to Dawkins about is why fields get stuck, what happened in our field in particular, and what one has to do in order to fix the theory that we've got in order for the discipline to again start moving forward. And it's a discussion that I don't think outside of a small number of people, most have not heard this view into what might be a future for one of the most important fields that there is.
Wow. Yeah, that's all sounds really exciting. I can't wait for that event. Um, just to speak a little bit on how we're stuck, and maybe this is just like me asking you for your best guess, but are we any closer at all to figuring out um, the starting point of life?
That's one of those questions that we may never have it.
Right.
I think what we have is more detail on what may have happened. But unfortunately, one of the things that one has to accept when you study a historical science like evolution is that time overwrites data. And so the farther you are from an event, the less of an echo it's left for you to study. And in the case of the beginning of life on Earth, it may well be that that's far enough back that the data simply does not exist. It cannot be found in order for us to nail it down definitively. On the other hand, I think we have a pretty good landscape of possibilities, what it must have looked like. And for most purposes, that's sufficient. It would be lovely to have the answer of how this evolutionary trajectory began, but it's not necessary in order to understand the evolutionary nature of modern creatures.
Do you have a best guess?
I would be hesitant to give you a best guess, but I do have a perspective that I think for me is better than an answer, a specific answer.
Right.
And it has to do with the fact that adaptive evolution in the biological sense is a special case of a kind of selection that is taking place all the time in the universe, everywhere, even where there's no life. And so what adaptive evolution is the enhancement of that process that comes along with the addition of one new component, which is heredity. At the moment you have something that functions like heredity, which is really just a pattern that reproduces itself, but with enough variation that you can have more successful and less successful entities. Once that last piece of the puzzle is added, then biotic evolution is the result, and it results in fantastic diversity as the universe explores the space of possibility.
Very cool. All right, let's talk. I wanted to talk cancer. Um, is cancer something we can evolve away from, evolve out of, and has it started, or are we just seeing the beginning effects of this, or what do you see when you look at cancer?
Well, I want to somehow I want to divorce you from all of the things that you think you know about cancer and the horror that it is, because you really need to stand in a very different place in order to see what's going on.
Sure.
We are the product of a tremendous amount of extremely elegant anti-cancer machinery. That's why you have almost no chance of coming down with cancer before you're 40, because of the effectiveness of all of these adaptations. So when we talk about cancer, mostly what we are talking about are the ultimate failure of a system that is darn near perfect for decade after decade of life. And it is really crucial that one recognize that yes, it would be lovely to address cancer well, but that until you realize how well it has been addressed to begin with, you're not really in a position to understand why it is so difficult to, let's say, increase the level of cancer resistance until you're 80, such that it matched the level that you have up until you're 40. So, with all that said, it is not possible to escape it entirely. We may, in fact, be near optimal with respect to how well cancer is fended off. It is likely that there are technological breakthroughs that will allow us to manage cancer in a way that could one day render it a trivial concern. In other words, if you're composed of, let's say, 30 trillion cells, and you're really looking for a needle in a haystack, the occasional cell that runs away, doesn't listen to the messages that tell it to stop dividing, and then escapes the failsafe built into each cell that prevents a runaway cell from turning into a tumor, you're looking for a very rare incident, someplace
Right.
where you've got multiple mutations that set a cancer in motion. But there are hallmarks that go along with that transition. And if we could effectively scan for either chemical signatures or some sort of radiological signature that would tell us that this process had happened, it's possible that we could essentially remove cancers before they ever had a chance to spread, whereas what we do currently is we don't figure out that you have a cancer until it's gotten away from us enough to cause a pathology, at which point it's very, very late from the point of view of cells having moved elsewhere.
Right. So why are these abnormal cells dividing anyway?
Well, that's really the flip side of a different question, which is how do you make a multi-trillion cell organism that is self-assembling, self-repairing, and very long-lived?
Hmm.
In order to do that, you have to have some machinery that allows good cells to replace damaged cells. And the ability for cells to replace other cells is the capacity that runs amok when we get a tumor. So, in essence, we always have to be aware that it is the downside of something that allows us to live as long as we do that causes tumors and cancer. And all of the promises that people make about curing cancer tend to obscure that relationship, because the question that we should always ask about some new treatment is how much does it compromise our ability to repair our tissues, which is what allows us to remain vigorous as long as we do.
Right. So when you were younger, let's say back in your high school formative years, were you always interested in science or in particular biology, or was this something that came on in university?
Oh, I was definitely scientifically oriented from the beginning, and I was also very interested in nature, and in particular, I've been fascinated since I was 3 or 4 at animals and how they behave and what their nature is, why they are the way they are. And so anyway, that very naturally developed into a professional interest in these things. But no, it didn't. It started early. My grandfather was a chemist and also very much a generalist with respect to interest in science. And he he took kids very seriously, and he would answer any question, any good question that was posed to him, and he would tell you at what point you had exceeded his ability to answer the questions. And so it was very compelling to have somebody who took all of the, you always hear kids ask difficult questions about why things are the way they are, and to have somebody who dedicated himself to answering those questions, I think created a kind of addiction for knowing why things are the way they are.
Yeah, and I mean that just speaks to how important it is to be inspiring people with science. I think it's just scientific inspiration, artistic inspiration are hugely important currencies, I think, and I think they're also underestimated. But I always say at all my events and basically everything, let art and science inspire, because I think these are two modes that are highly important and keep giving and giving and giving to us. Um, so I like to hear those stories of how you were inspired and who helped you be inspired. Um, Last question for you, Brett. What excites you most about the future of humanity?
Well, that's a tough one. I must say I'm excited by the prospect of seeing what the next phase of the human story is, and I'm also concerned that we're not going to make it there. That it's very hard to detect how much danger we are in based on the fact that a lot of our day-to-day experience suggests things are pretty darn good. And getting people to tune into the hazards we've created for ourselves when we're not starving, and if you live in the developed world, violence is relatively rarely encountered. All of these things suggest that whatever we're doing is working pretty well. So the existential threats are going to loom at the level of abstraction until something crosses a threshold.
Is human violence on the top of your list for the most dangerous?
Well, I think it functions as a kind of amplifier for everything. So we have lots of threats that are existential for a particular population, but would not be threats for humanity as a whole, but for the fact that we have weapons of mass violence that are armed and ready to go if certain conflicts go certain directions. And so, one thing that I fear is that humanity might be able to learn a very painful lesson about existential threats from some large scale catastrophe that would sober us up. But any large scale catastrophe runs the risk of turning into, let's say, a nuclear conflagration, or if it's of a certain nature, it could unplug nuclear reactors from the grid for enough time to cause many meltdowns in a region, which there's lots of havoc that could run away if we don't tune into the fact that we've hooked ourselves together in an unprecedented fashion. So it's not that violence itself is the greatest threat. It's a tragedy that it happens, and over things where it could have been avoided if people had thought to predict it. But violence itself would not threaten humanity's existence, but for this new high level of technology that is now tied to it.
Well, Brett, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks, Travis. This has been fun.
All right, everyone, thank you so much for tuning in, and let art and science inspire.